everyone. Welcome to my first podcast. I'm hoping to do a series of 10, 15 podcasts through which I hope that I will take you through a journey on how Southall has been developed as a social, cultural, and political capital of Asian communities in Britain by our kind of forefathers and the early settlers. This particular podcast will focus on the period between 1950 to 1960. And I will be covering a number of issues, including the early migration, the movement to Southall from East London, and the development of some of the early institutions such as the Indian Workers Association and the first Sikh temple in Southall. The context in which the early Asians started coming to Britain was primarily the partition of India, then their kind of dependence on agriculture and the continual division of the agricultural land within families, which created smaller land holdings amongst many people. And also the connection with the British Army and obviously the lack of jobs in the Punjab area. The first migration from India started in the late 1940s, particularly after the Second World War. And in particular, it was mainly from the Doaba region of Punjab, the two districts of Hoshiarpur and Jalandhar. At that time, most of the Punjabis who migrated into England were mainly kind of farming people. And their journeys were facilitated by what were then called travel agents, who made the arrangements for these kind of migrant workers, most of whom were unable to speak, read, or write English. And the first settlement was created around the Aldgate and Stephanie area in East London. And the reason for that was that the early migrants who came to Britain came by ship, and the East London area was the area where you had the East London docks where the ships came, other than in Southampton. So also the other main reason was that prior to 1940, during the period up to 50, there had been previous student settlements in the East London area. And because of that particular connection, people started going to East London. By about 1950, there were an estimated 1,000 or so Punjabi, primarily Sikhs, in the East London area, in the borough of Stephanie, and primarily clustered around the Aldgate. And the area had the only recorded grocery shops and cafes which were owned by Indians. The only other area of settlement was around the Shepherd's Bush area, because that area housed the only Gurdwara in London, which was known nationally and internationally. It was originally called Papindra Dharamsala, but it was the point where most people coming from India went to the Gurdwara and stayed there and were then collected by relatives and friends in this country already settled here and taken to places like Coventry, Birmingham, and Gravesend, which were the other main Asian settlements in this country at that particular time. So the Gurdwara in the Shepherd's Bush area acted as a kind of a social center for the London's Asian community as well, particularly on kind of Sundays. The connection between Aldgate and Southall basically came around because at the time, the Aldgate area did not have manufacturing jobs, and most of the work revolved around the clothing industries. But because of the discrimination against migrant workers, and particularly Sikhs and Asians and Black communities, the Asian community started, many people in the Asian community started working as peddlers. And what that meant was you were self-employed, you got a license, and you sold goods, which at that time primarily were clothing, and particularly women's clothing, which these people then went on to sell by knocking on people's doors, etc. The working conditions in factories were obviously horrendous if you could manage to get a job in the first place. So you have this community, Asian community in the Aldgate East area, and the main link between the establishment of Southall and the Aldgate community was a rubber factory. The rubber factory's general manager had served in the Sikh battalion in the British Army in India prior to independence of India. And during on one occasion, he met a Gyani Singh who'd kind of served with him in the same Sikh battalion. And as a consequence of that incidental meeting, Gyani Singh started working for the rubber factory. The general manager had a particular view of the Sikh communities particularly, and held them in high regard and considered them hardworking and honest people, along with being trustworthy. So the employment of Gyani Singh was the critical factor in the establishment of the Asian community of Southall over the decade. Gyani Singh lived in Aldgate East area, and his fellow countrymen began to find out of the opportunity to work at the rubber factory. And started going to rubber factory, which was situated at the border of Southall and Hayes, and started getting jobs there. And the word slowly spread across the community in the Aldgate area that Sikhs were managing to get jobs at the rubber factory, and many people Sikhs started traveling, making the journey from Aldgate East to Southall. Now, the journey at that time itself was quite difficult. Most of the people traveling from Aldgate East to the rubber factory would have to spend a lot of money. They did not know the language, often got lost. So the daily commute to Hayes Southall rubber factory was often taking something like 2 hours. And the journey involved taking a train, a bus, uh, and this led to a number of Asians who were prominent in Aldgate East and also worked in the rubber factory to purchase houses in Southall. So they and their countrymen didn't have to do this daily commute to and from Aldgate and the rubber factory, as well as to save money. Prominent amongst these individuals were people like Pritam Singh and Janelle Singh Gura and Fakir Singh. I mean, by the mid 1950s, Fakir Singh Gill had purchased something like 10 houses in Southall so that his countrymen who worked at the rubber factory didn't have to commute daily. So people started living in Southall from about the mid 1950s. Prior to, between the period 1950 to about 1955, there were only a handful of houses owned by Asians in Southall. Very small settlements. So what you witnessed by about the mid 50s was large numbers of Asians living in what then were 3-bedroom small houses. And the area that they lived in was then called the Hamborough Ward, the area between Beaconsfield Road, the Broadway, streets such as Abbots Road, Oswald Road, Woodlands Road, Townsend Road. And that, the other side of Southall was at the time referred to as Old Southall, the area over the railway, Southall Railway Bridge. That area was considered old because it didn't have access primarily to all the transport facilities and connections, but also the prices of houses were less. And most of the shops and businesses were situated along the Broadway. So people preferred, due to accessibility of transport, to live in the Hamborough Ward area. Over the period of 1950 to 1959, very few Asians were actually registered on the electoral register, voting register of Ealing. In 1954, for example, there were no Asians registered on Ealing's electoral register. By about in 1955, there was only 8 Asians registered, and that was they were living on Inverness Road in Southall. And in 1956, for example, 2 houses, one on Randolph Road and one on Beaconsfield Road, were registered. And by 1950, though there was an estimated population of about 12 to 1400 Asians, primarily men, hardly about 10%, if not less, were formally registered at the Ealing electoral register. One of the reasons behind not registering was the fear that the council would intervene and evict them due to overcrowding. Because on one hand, they were forced literally to live in overcrowded conditions because white residents wouldn't let them accommodation. So getting a room for Asians was almost impossible. At the time, it was common for there to be publicly displayed signs saying uh, rooms to let, no coloreds, no blacks, along with no Irish and sometimes no pets. So the idea of finding accommodation at that particular time for our people was almost impossible. In 1956, up till that period, most those Asians living in Southall were dependent on the Aldgate area for everything, including uh, getting hold of daily foodstuffs like dal and roti, flour, and what happened was that a number of Asian businesses and businessmen in East London started bringing foodstuffs to Southall via vans. They would kind of knock on Asian houses because the network knew who lived where, sell them whatever they needed, keep a little book, and it was common practice for at that time for people to uh, take the goods, buy the goods, but pay later in installments because many people were not in employment or were in between jobs and were saving a lot of money to send back to their relatives and families back home. The first Asian shop uh, was opened by Pritam Singh Sangha in partnership with Janal Singh Gura, who both had lived in East London but has also worked together at the rubber factory. The shop, the first shop was based at 8 The Green, just next to Southall Bridge near the corner of Beaconsfield Road. And it sold Asian foodstuffs mainly. And it became the almost the cultural, the social center of our community at that time. That is where you went to meet people, get new local news, etc. And Mr. Pritam Singh Sangha, Sardar Pritam Singh Sangha, I should say, was a critical person in the kind of development of the history and the history of Southall. The second shop was opened by Bakshi Singh Basi on Talbot Road. Now, Mr. Basi himself had originally lived in Aldgate East area and had also worked at the rubber factory. And he started his shop in Talbot Road, which was considered Old Southall at that time. So you had two shops in each part of Southall by about 1958. During this period, one of the things that happened was the establishment of the Indian Workers Association. The Indian Workers Associations, originally referred to as Bharatiya Mazdoor Sabhas, had been set up in the early 1930s to campaign and work and create awareness of the Indian independence struggle within Britain and working class people in this country. After the independence of India, these Bharatiya Mazdoor Sabhas ceased to exist in their original format and were reorganized. And the first reorganized Indian Workers Association was in Coventry. And in Southall, the movement to establish the Indian Workers Association in Southall was started in about 1955. By 1956, local activists such as Ajit Singh Rai, Vishnu Dutt Sharma, Amar Singh Thakkar, Jaswant Singh Tami, Harban Singh Rupra, and others started kind of mobilizing to create the Indian Workers Association Southall, because the conditions facing the newly arriving Asian workers in this country were horrendous. I mean, they've suffered racial discrimination, which was so blatant and overt that it bordered on criminality. The working conditions at factories were really bad. White workers refused to kind of undertake jobs that our workers were forced to work. They had no choice. If they didn't take those jobs, they would be sacked. If they didn't do what the management told them, they would be sacked. Getting jobs due to discrimination was huge problem in our community at the time. Most of the people who came here in the 50s, particularly from the Punjab area, and primarily Sikhs, all had turbans. And hardly any company, any factory would give them a job unless they removed their turbans. One of the factors at the time was that in order to get a job, you had to physically walk up to a factory, and in order to enter its offices, you had to go through a gate where there would be a gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper would prevent colored people even entering the factory premises. So you had hardly any chance of getting a job. The way you got a job, and that included the rubber factory, was that you had to know somebody inside already working. Often you had to pay a small bribe in order to get through to the office and then later on to get the job. So the conditions were quite bad. Asian workers were discriminated against not only by management, but by the unions and white colleagues who were supposed to be supportive of them. So there was a combined kind of force of management and union preventing Asian workers from seeking equal pay and equal rights. It was common practice for Asian workers to receive less wages than their white counterparts for the same job. Asian workers were forced into doing often 12-hour shifts, often 7 days a week. Refusal to do this would basically mean being sacked from one's job. So people had to tolerate this massive injustice because of this sense of responsibility to families back home, the need to send money back home to support extended families, not just their immediate families, but extended family. So the IWA became the forefront of the movement to begin to raise a voice, begin to provide a platform for the grievances, the discrimination, and the inequalities that our workers were being subjected to in the 50s, throughout the 50s. By about 1956, the Indian Workers Association activists had managed to recruit about 200 members, and they started booking the community center on Bridge Road to meet weekly. And that and by 1958, they had held their first elections and elected their first committee, by which time they had about 400 members. In about 1957, the Indian Workers Association probably hosted the first social cultural event in Southall. And that event was a celebration of the Indian Independence Day. And you had dignitaries, the Indian High Commissioner, Chief Minister of Punjab, attending that particular event. The Indian Workers Association also, by the late 1950s, started showing Indian films once a week. It hired the community center originally, and then what was a bingo hall come Dominion Center cinema to show these films. It had a list of all the residents, Asian residents, and how they would go about organizing this would be they'd prepare a leaflet, drop it house to house to all the addresses that they had on their list, informing the local Asian community about the film, the title of the film, and the venue for the film. And that is how they would kind of market this. And it was the only social outlet at that time. It also, at the community center, Southall Community Center, it also held social welfare activities, particularly helping Asian workers to read letters from back home and writing replies to back home. Remember, at that time, it used to take about at least 2 weeks for a letter from UK to reach India, and then another 2 weeks for that reply to be received in the UK. As most of the people, the early settlers, could not read or write, sometimes even Punjabi, the IWA helped them not only read these letters and communicate it, but also support them to navigate the system, the culture, the social norms in this country. It was common for the early settlers who'd been here since the early 50s to kind of teach the newer settlers arriving in this country about the manners and the customs in this country. I mean, everybody wore three-piece suits because they wanted the white community here to see them as respectful, well-dressed, and they were told to say the first words they learned was often please and sorry. They learned new kind of cultural norms such as not to spit on the streets, to stand in an orderly fashion in queues, to let ladies kind of sit down on seats first. These were kind of cultural changes that people had to become accustomed to. The other main kind of development in the 1950s was the movement to develop a Sikh temple in Southall. Throughout the 50s, most people living in the London area, as well as settling in Southall, used to go to Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara, the only one in London. The journey from Southall to Shepherd's Bush actually at the time comparatively costed quite a bit because people were working in low paid jobs. Some of the people kind of tell me that in order to save money, they used to go on a bicycle to Shepherd's Bush and come back. And one of the problems was that many people couldn't go to the Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara even once a week on Sundays because they had to work 7-day week shifts. And the mindset of our elders at that time was basically save, 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 so that they could send money back to support their extended families back, often increase the land holding that they had, or to build a house. So the original people who started going to the Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara began to develop links between themselves and decided and identified the need to set up a Gurdwara in Southall. Some of the original founding members of the movement to set up a Gurdwara in Southall included Ram Singh Flora, Son Singh, affectionately known as Akali Son Singh, Surjit Singh Bilga, Gurbaksh Singh, and Karam Singh Khela. And what they decided to do, these devout Sikhs, they started renting a working men's club on Shackleton Road once a week on Sundays. And obviously, they had to go there early in the mornings, clean the place up because it housed a bar, smelt of alcohol and cigarette. So once a week, volunteers would go there, clean the place up, and then they would make food, langar at home. There were very few women in Southall in the 1950s. The few they were there, basically confined to their houses, weren't allowed to work but look after the household. And they prepared, along with some men, prepared the langar, took it to the Gurdwara hall, which acted as a Gurdwara, and distributed it. So their Sunday session, an original Sunday session, was for about 3 hours. One significant player was Gyani Dharm Singh Sandhu. Now, Gyani Dharm Singh ji was a Granthi at the Shepherd's Bush Gurdwara, but he also worked at the rubber factory and lived on Lady Margaret Road, which was just around the corner from Shackleton Hall. So he doubled up and volunteered to act as a Granthi. And the Sikhs decided to set up a Sikh cultural society with the objective of setting up a new Gurdwara. And by the end of the decade, by about 1959, they had agreed this mission of working towards setting up a Gurdwara in Southall. So there began the journey, or rather, these early settlers, pioneers, sowed the seeds of the most significant organizations in Southall, namely the Indian Workers Association, Southall, and what is now the Sri Guru Singh Sabha, Southall Gurdwara. And the Indian Workers Association, Southall, by virtue of the work it started doing against injustice and inequality in the factories, began to inspire other smaller communities to set up other Indian Workers Association. So in that sense, Southall began to organize and begin to make a role for itself on the national stage. And even by 1959, it was recognized as a community, and the Indian High Commission had particular links with activists in the Southall community. In the next kind of chapter, I will be covering the period of 1960 to 1965. And if people have information to share on the period that I've just covered and on the other period that I will cover, please send it to us, to me particularly. The next podcast will be held on Sunday, 6th of April, between 2 and 3 p.m. So, friends, tune in. You can find more information about this podcast, series of podcasts, and the podcast my other colleagues will be doing by connecting with our website, Platform Southall. The website address is www.platformsouthall.org.uk. I hope you found this session interesting. Stay tuned. Follow me on the next podcast, and we will be going through a journey on the history of Southall. Thank you.